I'll start. Thank you all for coming. I'm Gigi Barnhill. What am I? I'm the president of the Board of Trustees of the Amherst Historical Society, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here. Today we're fortunate to have Annaliese Bischoff, who will talk about her recently published book, The Man Who Loved Trees, about Professor Frank A. Waugh. The Man Who Loved Trees tells the story of Frank Waugh, who lived from 1869 to 1943, and his evolving love of trees. Waugh was a professor of landscape architecture and a pioneering advocate of native planting design, which is something we hear a lot about today. He wrote prolifically about trees and landscape design, publishing over 20 books and 300 articles. He urged people to enjoy nature in the way that they enjoyed music or painting or sculpture. And I wonder how he found time to enjoy nature with that schedule. And The Man Who Loved Trees is based on a treasure trove of Professor Waugh's unpublished material, including a large group of prints, as I understand it. Our speaker joined the faculty at the Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning program at UMass Amherst in 1980 and taught courses in design studio, writing, and history. Her research advocated creative design exploration. Annaliese Bischoff developed courses on research and grant writing in the arts for the Commonwealth Honors College, where she taught a senior thesis course on sustainable art, retiring in 2015. So it's a treat to welcome you here today, and the audience is yours. Thank you so much.
I've been looking forward to this audience, and I have given this particular presentation a bit of a spin to focus on the Amherst connections. At least I'll highlight some of them. There's so many, so it is really a great privilege to be able to share this work. Just a little plug for my book. I'm not really selling it here today, but I do have some bookmarks that you're welcome to take. I just want to note that copies of this book are available locally at the Amherst bookstore. And also the university store has elected to cover it. They don't carry too many books these days, and I'm really proud that it is in their collection. So I want to start a little bit with Frank Waugh's life. In my book, I'm not actually giving you a biography. I'm creating selected vignettes of his life that support the whole history of his becoming an artist at the end of his life. So I don't note that he was born in Sheboygan, Wisconsin in 1869, for example. But I do talk about his early years as he was growing up on a large farm that his father had claimed as a Civil War veteran when he was really just a toddler. And he grew up in this kind of landscape out in Kansas, where his dad experimented with trees, especially fruit trees and other more ornamental trees, to see what could be adapted to the rigors of the Kansas soil. So Waugh grew up with this kind of interest out in McPherson County, Kansas. And he chose to study horticulture, botany, landscape gardening at what was then Kansas State Agricultural College. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in 1891 and actually completed a master's degree there as well in 1894. During this time, he had to take a little time off to earn some money to support his studies. So he worked as a newspaper editor. And this is a drawing he did of himself. You can see he probably was like working off of this particular photograph. So he gained some very valuable experience that we'll see later came in handy for him. He knew how to talk to newspaper editors. And while he was a student, he was smitten with Alice Vale. He met her at a croquet game. That was a relatively new game at the time, at least new to them. And they took an entomology course together, and they also took surveying together. And they married Yeah, from the time of their wedding, they posed for this particular photograph, which one of the family members led me. Isn't it wonderful? Yeah. And so Waugh also had an interest beyond horticulture and botany in art as well as music. And he played the flute daily and became quite accomplished. He even wrote music. Some people would describe him as a Renaissance man. And he also had an avid interest in photography. This has not been studied enough, in my opinion. But in 1920, it was 22, this article in the Christian Science Monitor in April appeared, focusing on Waugh's photography hobby, which especially focused on doing portraits of people. And our Jones Library Special Collections has a great collection of his portraits, as does our special collections at UMass of these portraits. And he included portraits of presidents and policemen and coachmen, Ray Standard Baker, for example, his own sons, the artist Hans Meyer. This is really a very unstudied collection, but he was quite an avid photographer, doing portraits of people, I want to point out. Beyond just doing photography, he also wrote extensively about photography, and he developed some of his own techniques. These are just a sampling of some of those articles he published, of the 300 articles he published. Some are actually about gum bichromate developing, which he pretty much developed a particular technique of his own. He wrote about lantern slides, those glass lantern slides. He hand-colored them himself. So he has quite a gamut of skills. He certainly is a kind of Renaissance fellow, if you will. The Jones Library has been so generous in letting me use the materials. And one is a letter that Waugh wrote to his oldest daughter, Dorothy Waugh, that basically is just a kind of curious statement that somehow he really has a hard time photographing women. He loves doing portraits, but he just has a really tough time doing portraits of women in general, and even of his wife, his beloved, cherished wife, which he shares in this particular. And yet, here is one of his very exquisite photographs of his wife in the kitchen of the home that they lived in for almost for a number of decades, that I think is just quite stunning, a pinhole. So Frank Waugh married, started a family, very proud of his firstborn, Dan, and the family began to grow with Dorothy, Dan, and Frederick, and almost a 50-year marriage in all. But Waugh did photograph not only people, but landscapes, of course. And oftentimes, he would use his family members to pose, somewhat for human scale, but just to add that sense of narrative, if you will. And so here, Waugh is actually posing himself and having the photograph taken, and here is Alice amidst some elms, more likely in Amherst itself. And he often had his children, as well as his own students and colleagues. Before we get to the Amherst connection highlights that I want to share with you today, I do want to give an overview of the geography of his academic life, because he wasn't just based in Amherst. He was important in his time. So as I mentioned, he was in Kansas, which is based in Manhattan, Kansas. So he was there 1886 to 1893, and then on to Stillwater, where he had a professorship, 1893 to 1895, on to then Burlington, where he stayed until he moved to Amherst. So in 1902, he came to Amherst with his family and stayed until his death. But of course, he was out and about, and I'll share some of those connections as well. He started a doctorate under the esteemed botanist Liberty Hyde Bailey at Cornell. But he never finished that PhD, largely because of his burgeoning family and those responsibilities. And although he was the financial breadwinner of the family, he and his wife shared a kind of a partnership and really treated each other as equals with so much respect. And they cherished each other. So that PhD never happened. During the first sabbatical that Waugh earned, he went to Berlin in Dahlem, and he studied with Willy Lang. And this was very influential, because Willy Lang was a proponent of native planting design, quite a character. This was important. And Waugh knew German, so he could read Lang's books. And they continued a correspondence and connection. In 1923, Waugh taught at Los Angeles. And in 29 and 1930, he taught at Dartmouth College courses for non-landscape architecture majors, which actually included one with Nelson Rockefeller. The year before he married, he was a junior, and Rockefeller was really enthusiastic about a big model that he created for Waugh's course. So this probably had some influence in Rockefeller's life as well that is unreported and unexplored further. But I want to point out that Waugh also visited Japan and China, and there were some significant connections there. And lastly, when Waugh turned 65, he took up the art of etching. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that form of printmaking, but it's extensive and significant. I also have done printmaking, woodcuts, as well as etchings, so I can speak with some experience of how demanding this art form is. And to begin it at age 65, in 1934, is something that just caught me. It caught me in 2003, by the way, when I discovered that Waugh did etchings and that University of Massachusetts owned some of these etchings, and they were at the University Gallery, which is now the Contemporary Museum of Art, and also in special collections there. And I'd make these appointments and put on the gloves and pour through them. And in 2003, I did a small exhibit at UMass on the etchings. And this began my rather expensive hobby in its session. And it's continued to this day. So anyway, he began studying with George Pierce Ennis. Now, Ennis apparently had a summer home up in one of the townships, probably in Lake Pleasant. And it's likely how Waugh first met George Pierce Ennis. But Ennis ran a school in New York, the Grand Central Art School, and in the summer he taught a program up in Eastport, the Eastport Summer School. And etching was one of the forms of art that was taught there. Then, tragically, Ennis was killed in an automobile accident, and so Waugh lost his first teacher. But he decided to continue his formal pursuit of etching studies. And in 1937, he went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Fontainebleau, where his youngest son, Sidney, we'll talk a bit about him later, had studied in 1927, studied sculpture, and went on to become a very, very well-known artist, especially glass artist and sculptor. So that's a story we will get to. And lastly, I've been able to document that in 1939, Waugh went up to study in Maine. He didn't study etching per se, but he did study at the Summer School of Drawing and Painting with Charles Woodbury. This is the year before Charles Woodbury passed. Waugh later published an article called Drawing Trees, in which he said Woodbury was one of his greatest teachers ever. And I was able to document that Charles Woodbury taught courses in art at Dartmouth College, overlapping with the time when Waugh was teaching courses in landscape gardening as an art form. It's a small college. They very likely knew each other then. It would be very unusual if they didn't, but I don't have more documentation than that. So as I mentioned, Waugh had a burgeoning family with Sydney, Albert, Esther, Dorothy, Frederick, Dan, his wife, Alice, and him, posing in this kind of staircase. This is probably from about 1905, the Jones Library estimates. The family also owns several copies of this. And so Waugh began, he created a program of landscape gardening at what was the Mass Ag College by 1903. He moved here with the family in 1902. Sydney wasn't yet born. And during his time, he actually got Wilder Hall designed and built. This was the first building that we know in the country to be designed to house a program of landscape gardening. And it was built, well, basically by 1905, here it is. And interestingly, the architect was a very well-known architect. You can look up his other work. It was Walter Wilcox, who at the time was based in Burlington, Vermont, where Waugh had known him when he was a professor up in Vermont. So what I want to point out here is that part of the design on the first floor included a museum, a place where artwork could be shared with students, townspeople, other colleagues from the university. So this is important, I think, to know. And on the top floor was a dark room where photography could be developed. One thing I do want to point out is that Waugh kept diaries daily. These were blank 365-day journals with the lined paper. I was lucky enough to get the journals that still existed that were able to be opened. Some were suffering from mold. But from Dr. John Stuart Waugh, the late professor from MIT, I was able to borrow and photograph every entry between 1905 and 1922. Now the handwriting is a bit tricky, but I'm pretty adept at reading it. And here you can sort of see a typical entry. I wanted to point out that here Waugh is pointing out that the Amherst Women's Club is invited to Wilder Hall to see the Corot pictures that he had on view in that museum room, for example. This is the kind of information you can glean from these diaries. Of course, what I really wanted was to know, why did he take up etching at 65? And those diaries were missing. So in 2010, I began a book. I had a wonderful contract with the Center for American Places. They got bought out by someone else, and suddenly they weren't so interested in my book title. And I hadn't found the information I really wanted and needed. So we parted ways amicably with the new publisher, and I gave up. And so it was a little ill-fated, but that's the way it went. Here's another excerpt I wanted to share. I've transcribed it because I don't expect you to be expert in reading Waugh's handwriting. But the point of this is that he's kind of coming to terms with his career. He was always pushing and always wanting to explore and develop. But he basically decided that what was going to work for him was to be an academic administrator. That was going to be it, and he couldn't really specialize. So he abandoned, as I mentioned, that PhD with Liberty Hyde Bailey, and he was still holding on to calling the field landscape gardening. He thought that was friendlier and kind of less haughty than the term landscape gardening, or landscape architecture, which is of course what Harvard was using from 1899 on. And he didn't just stick with academic administration. By 1908, he and his dear colleague, Fred Sears, bought over 225 acres of land to start this commercial venture with orchards. And they founded the Bay Road Fruit Farm. This is in 1908. At some point, if I have more time and energy, I want to document that sequence of maps of that land. And I haven't yet done that, but that's something perhaps I'll do in the future. I'm speaking for the Amherst Women's Club in the spring. Maybe by then we'll get to that. But this was pretty much undeveloped land, and it is where we find both the Atkins Farms, Country Market, and Applewood today. I just want to point out. And here are some snaps, some pictures from that time. Here is Alice posing for Frank in the orchard itself, and there is Frank in his orchard. And not sure exactly when this photo was taken, but it is showing the Bay Road fruit stand. I don't know if that is in Frank's time or afterwards. But they ran this from 1908 to 1927. And at that time, Sears and Waugh agreed to sell the business to their farmhand Pritchard, who pretty much ran it until I believe 1961. And I believe he sold it then to Howard Atkins. During this time, as I mentioned, Waugh was a prolific author. He did like to earn a little extra money for his burgeoning family to support them. And one of the ways he did this was to be paid for articles. And I think some of the most charming and the most delightful are a series from Women's Home Companion called The Alderbrook Farm. And here, Waugh has this kind of made-up family. Robert, and he poses, he gives himself the pen name of Robert Lane Wells. He stages his life that he's an architect, not a landscape architect, an architect from Ohio. And he has 4 children, not 6. And he goes on to talk about who they are. And he has this kind, I'm sure if he were alive and working today, this would be a blog of some sort or a podcast. But here is this kind of monthly series of updates. And it is based on real experiences of what was going on at the Bay Road Fruit Farm. But the family never lived at the farm. They lived, in fact, on campus in a residential building right next to Wilder Hall. It currently is the public health brick building, so their home was torn down. In real life, Waugh and his family enjoyed a lot of outings, and they had very special clubs for their children. Waugh developed the Spielerei for Saturday outings, where he would get his kids to observe, draw, write. And Alice developed the Oakley Club for the older children to do observations outdoors. And then so the younger ones wouldn't be pests tagging along, she created the special Lullaby Club, especially for Albert and Sydney. That they often went on vacation during the summers to Wellfleet, on the Cape, or up in Maine, for example. And they enjoyed creating greeting cards and sending to students, colleagues. So this is something that also was really moved by finding from, I don't have all the years, but I had quite a few of them. And by 1908, Waugh was continuing to publish about trees. I love the Dwarf Fruit Trees book, in which he uses children. It's part of his kind of sense of humor to show the dwarf trees and children side by side. It's sort of a very sweet thing. And there is one of his lantern slides of one of his children, I'm not sure which one. So he's still publishing about trees. But by by 1910, he's waxing poetic, and he publishes a book called The Landscape Beautiful. Now, this is not a candidate for a book to be published today. The language is quite antiquated. His landscape gardening book from 1899 and several other years, as well as 1926, did get republished in 2007 by UMass Press, as well as the Library of American Landscape History, thank you. But this was not a candidate to republish. And yet, it is, I think, a very important book. Here was talking about the importance of trees and how you can have a love of trees. Maybe not a full appreciation for the landscape yet, but every man, woman, and child can love a tree. Maybe they won't go to look at art in a museum or a gallery, but everybody has the accessibility of looking at a tree and seeing its great beauty and being moved by it. And so Waugh was popularizing trees for everybody. At the same time, he and his wife were both avid gardeners. On eBay, basically this journal of their own chronicles of their gardens came up for sale. I missed it by 2 seconds, but I was able to document the pages that were advertised. And what I'd love to find is that there's both Waugh's handwriting and Alice's handwriting side by side. And so this is like really important. Here are some sample entries from their journal. And this is their Mass Agricultural Home and Garden Journal. I don't know who has this in their hands. I believe someone does. They paid good money for it. I was outbid. I was so disappointed. But there were other efforts. And here, in the Jones Library Special Collections, you'll see a proposal for an herb garden for the library, for our library. And it's initialed by Baker. And Alice Waugh was also very active in the women's club and gardening. And so this is also some of the records of the connections that they leave for us. Beyond Amherst, Waugh really did quite a lot of work. He started consulting in 1917 for the U.S. Forest Service. He did a plan for the Grand Canyon Village, and he worked on a collaborative report for Mount Hood with Frederick L. Olmsted Jr. and John C. Merriman. Now this kind of work, interestingly, is not something that's going to be appreciated. These kinds of works are hard to even see today, but this is the kind of design work he did and contributed in his time. So it was a plan for the Grand Canyon Village. So, he's not really known for his design work, but he really did a lot of significant work across the country, including this report for Bryce Canyon National Monument in Cedar Breaks, which was in 1923. This is, 10 years before the CCC was starting to plant some invasive species of the tamarisk and the Russian olive, for example, down in the canyon. But anyway, this is the kind of work that he was doing, and it's really quite significant. And what he's saying in this report, the take-home is, let's have this space for everybody. Don't just let the railroads develop this for the well-to-do to come. This is so important. Let's have everybody be able to enjoy this space. And so he was really an advocate for a landscape for everybody. And he did lantern slides that we do have, probably from his visits. These are undated.
And those were hand-colored?
Yes, yeah. Hal Mosier donated his collection of lantern slides to the Robert S. Cox Special Collections. And all of those are available digitally. I'll be sending a link to George so that you can easily find them and go through over 800 of them. And they're beautifully cataloged, by the way. So you put in a location, if there's a lantern slide of it, you can probably find it. The oldest daughter, Dorothy, reported that her dad published 42 books. By my count, it's really over 30. Depends what you call a book, a pamphlet, whatever. But I wanted to show my collection of his books, some of which are first edition. But I wanted to also note that Mary Louise Gottheim, when she was translating her 2-volume History of Garden Art in the late 20s, invited Waugh to add a chapter on landscape architecture in North America. This is a really big coup for Waugh. And, you know, hardly anybody cares. But anyway, I just wanted to note that. And I know all the English translation volumes. So here are just some of the overviews. And here are some of the pen names that Waugh wrote under. Franz Bieler was basically taking his mother's maiden name and Germanicizing his first name, if you will. He was able to get a book out in 1942. He used the pen name of John Smedley. And it was all about home pork production. And it's kind of a very serious book about raising pigs, but it's also, I think, quite humorous in another way. I love Everybody's Garden. That book he dedicated to Alice. And the dedication reads, "She made a garden." And it's just so sweet. And anyway, I also really love the natural style in landscape gardening. And here's his family as they're getting older, growing up. A few points of what he accomplished. We're not going to spend time developing this, but he was actually serving for as a captain during World War I down at the Army General Hospital in New Haven, in charge of occupational therapy. And here he had all of the people under his watch, creating baskets, for example, doing signs, learning about photography. It was a sort of interesting point. And he was going on to become this pioneer, if you will, and a forerunner of modern ecology with his interest in native planting design. While he was here in Amherst, and I haven't shared this with other audiences, but you are the ones I wanted to share, that he formed this group early on. It's the date there, 1921. He formed this kind of social club called the Intellectuals, or Shubenacadie. And at first it was just men. They'd get together for kind of an art club sort of thing to talk about literature, art, their interests in whatever, and have dinner. And it is, the name Shubenacadie is actually from the Mi'kmaq language, meaning abounding in groundnuts. And one of the members was Fred Sears, who wound up actually spending his later years devoted to the Atlantic Canadian Indian School. And he was really very devoted to helping, especially with agriculture. And anyway, and so this went on until, these were just the notes that in Ray Stannard Baker's papers at the Jones Library are kept that show who spoke on what where. And I found it very helpful for my research to do this. So this is obviously before television. It was like a social club, if you will. And I was able to find that Waugh shared some work on etching to this group. It continued after his death, and there's some sort of fond notes about this. There's some correspondence between Ray Stannard Baker, the noted journalist, who wrote under the pen name of David Grayson, which was kind of one of those mysteries, if you will. And Ray, and this is actually, Ray Stannard Baker owns the home that is right at, well, it's now a fraternity, actually, and it's right next to the Gillen residence, where the wonderful Sunset Farm continues to flourish. And anyway, Ray and Frank would go off fishing. Frank published an article, one of his 300 articles, called "The Joys of Fishless Fishing," about what happens with that friendship. And Ray wound up doing a book about their friendship. And in the end, wound up doing a book called Under My Elm, which documents, you probably know the story better than I, documents his passion for that elm tree on Sunset Avenue that is across the street from where Ray Standard-Danger and his family lived. So there were these family connections. Basically, Ray was a great friend, not only to Waugh, but also to his children. And Dorothy Waugh, I wanted to talk a bit about as well, wound up writing a book and publishing it in 1942 called Warm Earth. All of the original drawings from this book are in the Jones Library. They are incredible. So this was one book that Waugh saw his daughter publish while he was still alive. And I wanted to just sort of share that aside, if you will. But as the family aged, they had a sense of humor, and when they would come back for reunions, they reenacted the staircase photo, which I think is really delightful. Here you see, probably from '39. In the early 30s, Waugh began to do some very serious research that was more about ecology and native planting design. And some of this work he published in Landscape Architecture articles. And I think this hasn't been studied enough. I am really very drawn to this work. Waugh had to retire when he turned 70. He had a great big family reunion in '38 and '39 when the whole family came together. And you can begin to see all the grandchildren. And he would typically take the grandchildren for excursions as well, one of which would be to that sycamore button ball in Sunderland. And he'd get all the kids to see how many it would take to encircle it. This is an etching that is currently on view at the Leverett Library until this Tuesday night at 5 o'clock, by the way. And I will be having another exhibit of Waugh's etchings at the Olver Design Building in April of 2025. We'll be celebrating Earth Day then. So you can see some in person. But I wanted to share on the event of Waugh's 50th observation of graduation. He edits and he shares this entry with his classmates from what is then Kansas State College. And in it, he notes that the most important event in his biography was marrying Alice, and the pride he has in each and every child in quite a singular family. And it wasn't just Alice, it was Frank and Alice together who raised 6 incredible children. And I'm not going to go into all of their accomplishments, but I just wanted to share a picture of the home in which they lived, and this note from Frank that at this point on his 50th anniversary of graduation, if you will, reunion, that Alice and I remain on the college campus in the house we have occupied for 39 years, and where we are beginning to feel at home. And this is his typical kind of odd humor. And here is an etching that he did that is called Home Sweet Home. So in his lifetime, Waugh would have students, colleagues over to this home, and the whole family would host everyone. It was really the gathering spot. In his own lifetime, he was able to see 2 important recognitions. In 1939, he was elected as a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects. And by 1918, actually, he had started using the term landscape architecture, kind of coming on board, realizing it's not so bad, it's not so haughty and arrogant. So he kind of gave way to term landscape architecture. But even more importantly, in 1941, he was awarded the George Roberts White Gold Medal of Honor by Mass Horticultural Society. This isn't just a state kind of accolade. This is really the highest kind of horticultural award that can be bestowed, certainly in this country. And they actually wrote up a very nice tribute to Waugh in 1941. And of course, by then, this was Mass State College. And sadly, Waugh died in March 1943. He'd been visiting his younger daughter, Esther, and family, and sadly died. And to celebrate his life, his friends, including Ray Standard Baker and others in Amherst, declared a celebration of his life, a whole week celebrating his life in the arts in August of 1943. Every day of the week would be devoted to a different art. One to music, one to etching, actually one to theater, one to photography, for example. And as it turned out, the people who knew about his music skills and talents did not necessarily know about his printmaking, and vice versa. So it was really a kind of a wonderful sort of sharing of his life and a tribute to how much he was valued. And a year later, President Baker, who was actually Ray Standard Baker's brother, declared that there be an arboretum, was able to get past the establishment of the Frank A. Waugh Arboretum by 1944. And today we have 8,000 trees, 350 different species on 1,450 acres on this arboretum that is really about a landscape for learning, research, and exploration. That's the mission. And it continues to flourish today. A former secretary who worked for Waugh for years is noted on the website for the Arboretum today that when Waugh would enter a room, it would just come alive. He made everyone in the room come to life. And he was interested in everything everyone had to say. So that's, I think we now have a really good tribute to Waugh on the website of the Arboretum at UMass that was just created, that portion of it just this year. And I've been invited to serve on the Arboretum, which I'm a very proud member. I want to talk a little bit about my own discoveries to get to a few more connections in Amherst. So, as I mentioned, I kind of gave up on doing the book. But in 2019, I got a call from a woman who runs an antique store of sorts, saying that she had gotten all these prints of Waugh, and she didn't really know what they could be sold for. And she found that I had an interest, since I had done this exhibit in 2003, I have a web presence about that. So she gave me a call and asked, what are these worth? And I basically said, well, he's not Frederick Judd Waugh, the nationally renowned artist. So he's not known as an artist, and they're not terribly valuable, except to me they are. And I do think they're really fine works. So she said, well, would you want to buy some? And I went, and basically I bought everything she was willing to sell. This included all these raggle-taggle materials in this kind of orange crate, which was addressed to a Miss Dibble-was in Amherst, Mass. And it turns out, I was able to find out that these were in the papers of a Ted Bacon, who had been dean at Amherst College, who then became a colleague I did not know, but he became a regional planning professor in the very department in which I started. He retired as I was coming on board. And I had all these notes from the department back in the 60s, for example, and all these etchings. And so it was a bit of a mystery, if you will. And the other And so I thought, well, maybe I need to go back to thinking about this book. At the same time, what I discovered was the Waugh Library Special Collections suddenly noted that they had Frank Waugh diaries from 1923 to 1943. By the time I found this out, it was the pandemic. So can you imagine? As soon as the pandemic lifted, I was able to recruit my very dear husband and got appointments to go and look at these diaries. And of course we had to prove that we had COVID shots daily and wear masks. I mean, we had to spend a week kind of proving that we were healthy, but got to those diaries. And I was able to find out definitively, yes, why he took up etching at age 65. And along the way, in that box, was a prospectus for a book that never got published, and a list of titles that included a tree book, a book of trees, the beauty of trees, trees for beauty, all these ideas for what a title of this prospectus might be, with a check mark, tree portraits. So here, proof positive was he had this prospectus for a book and ideas of how the pages should be. And the manuscript existed, as I found from letters, especially between Waugh and his daughter. But I own this prospectus. Of course, it's going to be given to special collections at UMass. But here is what he wanted to do, and he couldn't get it published. I didn't feel so badly that I couldn't get it. He actually said that one publisher had the book for a couple of years. I didn't feel so bad. Anyway, he talks about the intention of this book, which is basically to present pictures of trees, and he wants to really supplement all of the works about trees with these portraits. And in it, he notes that his preferred method of sharing the images of trees is etchings. He thought this would be the best form in a published book to share. And then second best, pen drawings, then maybe a couple of photographs. And so here it was finally this important proof. And then I was able to go to the diaries and find out who he studied with when and what he had to say, etc. And so then I was able to, when I found out that he did a drawing at a particular year, I was able to go back and go through every single entry that year to see if he happened to mention the beach etching that he was working on, for example. I was able to find drawings, such as this one called Hope. That's a pen drawing that I think is revealing his humor as well. And then this beautiful etching, which is also one that the Mead collection has a copy of, and which they bought.
Nice.
I know, it's not in the active, but they do own it. And then a few of the etchings that I find are just so moving. This is one that he did after he studied with Charles Woodbury of spruce up in Maine. And it captures that kind of movement, that sense of being alive. And then these elms up from Cambridge. And here you can see a rather primitive stick figure of a woman. Now you can't get human figures as well, but the portraits of the trees just come to life, and I am just enamored by these views. The Lombardy poplars, for example, and some primitive stick figures for scale. Here's a collection I put together of the trees I own that are of winter scenes, for example. And they're from all over the world. Many are local. So I believe that these etchings do form a kind of legacy. I think they form an enduring legacy, unlike the grand plans that are kind of lost and the antiquated writing. I do believe that these etchings are as valid today as they were when they were created. And I do think it's one way that beauty for all can be shared. Whether it's cypress swamp, whether it's sassafras, apple trees, junipers and beeches, witch hazels, the Burnham beeches. They're just amazing. And of course, one of my all-time favorites happens to be connected with Ray Stannard Baker. Now, Waugh knew how to plant a tree, and he actually did a number of articles about how you practically plant a tree to make it successful. But I do think the etchings are under-recognized and under-known. So, although the week I went, this placard right by Ray Stannard's house had been run down by a car. One of the residents was kind enough to bring it out of the front door and let me photograph it. But it's important to note that Ray Stannard Baker did these quiet essays about simple rural life under the pseudonym of David Grayson. And this includes the tree across the way that he helped save, purchasing the property so it wouldn't be cut down. And Waugh actually doing in 1942 this very beautiful etching called David Grayson's Elm. I actually own a few copies of this. And it is, I think, a prize. I discuss it a little bit more in my book. But I think this is, Waugh was kind of hopeful that maybe he could be Baker's new illustrator. One of his illustrators had passed away, or his illustrator had passed away. The publisher had already found a new illustrator, but this, I'm sure, was just an important gift for Ray Stannard Baker in any case. But I also wanted to point out a few other Amherst connections that I think are really significant. One of the things I learned was that the Waughs hired a woman to help with the household for, I believe, 2 days a week for many decades. And this woman was Mittie Hall Anderson, who was a remarkable, remarkable person. And she basically worked for the Waughs, coming from her home, which was on McClellan Street, and it's in a national district, and wound up being interviewed and saying, no, there's not a bad apple in the bunch of the Waugh family. So there was incredible mutual respect at this time. And Waugh did a portrait of Mittie Hall Anderson, which I think captures her dignity. And she was more than a house cleaner. She was an important force in their family. And Waugh's one etching that has a human figure that is not just a stick figure, that really shows a real person, is actually Mittie Hall Anderson from 1939, called Wash Day. And this is, I think, a very important etching. And then later, the oldest daughter, Dorothy, did a watercolor of Mittie Hall Anderson as well, which the Jones Library has in special collections. And I just wanted to point out a few points that basically Mittie Hall Anderson was able to buy her own home with the earnings she made as a housekeeper, cleaner. She worked for a few different families, and she helped found the Zion Church in Amherst. She was one of the ones to dig the first shovelful. She's buried with her husband in Amherst, and she had quite a life. It's really a whole other lecture unto itself. But one of the things I was able to find from the diary entries was how she would be amused by Waugh's rabbit hunting. And one of the things that Waugh did was hunt rabbits, and he actually gave her a bunch of rabbits, at least on one occasion, maybe more, that she would, and he always called her Mrs. Anderson, that she would then cook for church suppers. So I think this is an important kind of connection to just point out. That is an Amherst connection that also deserves more time and attention. And then I also wanted to point out a little bit more about the eldest daughter, Dorothy. She worked as a landscape architect herself for almost 10 years, and then wound up becoming an artist for the National Park Service, doing a lot of travel posters. There's going to be a really big exhibit at the Poster House in New York in next September through January. by Mark Resnick. That's important. But quickly, I wanted to kind of conclude on the note that that this woman, Mrs. Dubois, was the resident director of the Emily Dickinson House during a time when Dorothy Waugh, when she was older, was writing 2 books about Emily Dickinson. And Dorothy also did some watercolors of the Dickinson homesteads. So anyway, I think it's important to maybe add a little light that maybe this work for the book was being given to the resident director of the Emily Dickinson estate, who maybe then gave it to the former dean of Amherst College, who was the regional planning professor. These are mysteries still yet known, but I wanted to share that. And then another Amherst connection. The famous glass artist who worked for Steuben for so many years, won the Rome Prize, first studied architecture at MIT against his father's will, who wanted him, or actually studied sculpture, I should say, as well as architecture, and dropped out and got sick from MIT, came home and lived, and then persuaded his family to support him studying sculpture after all. Because Waugh didn't think he could be an artist and make a living. So he wanted his son to have a practical education. But Cindy wound up being a very successful artist. And in this book, in 1938, Waugh dedicates this Hardy Shrugs, or writes an inscription to his son, to my famous offspring from a near famous dad. And in 1939, Sydney wound up doing this 300-pound glass sculpture called Atlanticus, which was a tribute to all the immigrant workers in the glass industry who came, especially from Europe, to this country. That was in the 1939 World Fair in New York. And one other note that's at the Amherst connection is he designed the pediment for the Mead building, which actually houses a lot of his sculptures, only one Frank Waugh etching. And there was a blog with the Mead Museum that talked about Sidney's work as a monument man saving artwork during World War II, also another story. But Waugh began this interest in art, and he wound up concluding his life really by creating 223 listed etchings. I mean, I've made maybe 30 in my life. To do 223, that is unbelievable. And it's phenomenal how much work, and I think they're wonderful. So in 2027, I'm doing an exhibit at the Birger Sanson Memorial Gallery in Lindsborg, Kansas, where we will have a tribute to Waugh, and we might be able to get him in the American Council of Prints as a member of graphic arts. We'll see, that's in the works. But the tribute that lasts certainly is the Arboretum at UMass, which is a level 4, the highest level to be achieved. That is really all about just a living landscape, champion trees. And these are the kinds of tags you'll find on many of the trees. We have Earth Day and Arbor Day with all kinds of giveaways, promoting native trees, sort of awareness tags. The champion trees that we have, the famous Japanese elm, and then of course, one of my favorites is the black walnut tree, and these contemporary interpretations of why trees are important. I'm actually making ink from the husks of these black walnuts, and I'm going to do some portraits of the trees for hopefully the April exhibit if I'm successful. You won't see them if they come up. And then the management decisions today are really more about what do we do with when we have some of these beautiful trees that are exhibiting invasive characteristics versus their historic cultural significance. I'm running out of time, so I'll just conclude by today we have the town of Amherst having our beloved dear late Anne Kahn, who really pioneered the creation of the Orchard Arboretum, which is now a town of Amherst Arboretum, that features, it's a level 1 It's by Applewood, behind Atkins Market. Still some of the old trees from the time of Waugh. And when they die, they're used decoratively and ecologically in the gardens. And they feature 3 specialty bee gardens today. I mean, these are important tributes. If I were to talk about Waugh's legacy today, I think I can still talk about beauty for everybody. But of course, what we need to do is extend this to everybody. And we need to worry about those neighborhoods in Los Angeles where there aren't trees and where the heat index is through the roof. And we have to worry about those neighborhoods in Chicago where there are toxic soils, where there are higher rates of cancer and other illnesses. And trees can help provide a solution. So we need to certainly talk about climate crisis, sustainability, and I think ultimately the new work is tree equity. And that's what I think is the extension of Waugh's real legacy for today. So I will stop on that note. Yeah. And this doesn't talk about climate change, equity, diversity, all the important issues of today. It is simply an honest story about Waugh in his own time. And if anyone wants a bookmark, you're welcome to have.